Hi, my name's Dr. James Byland. I'm the owner and director of the Byland Clinic.
Hi, my name is Danielle Morales. I'm a licensed educational psychologist and co-director of the Byland Clinic.
And today we're going to be talking about dysgraphia. Dyslexia is a topic that certainly gets a lot of attention and coverage, but increasingly we're getting referrals from parents concerned about possible dysgraphia. And so we thought we'd take the time today to talk about what dysgraphia is, how we might assess for that, and what we can do to help kids that have writing disabilities. So Danielle, maybe you can start out by talking to us about what dysgraphia is and maybe even um, sort of diving into the different types of dysgraphia.
Sure, yeah. So concisely, dysgraphia is a neurodevelopmental disability impacting one's ability to write. So it is a learning disability in the area of writing. And just like other learning disabilities, there's different subtypes or different presentations. And this is particularly true for writing because there's so many different components that go into the active written expression. So, for example, there can be impacts in handwriting, so the actual physical act of writing, the motor component, fluency, so how quickly somebody can come up with ideas or language that they then are able to put down on paper, spelling, and then also someone's ability to organize their written expression clearly. So, make sure that they're capturing all of the ideas that they need to in something like an essay, a paragraph, a sentence, that they're using correct grammar, organization, sentence structure, so that they are expressing themselves in a way that is able to be clearly understood by the reader. So we can break down each of those because they each are a different type of dysgraphia. So the first type of dysgraphia that folks may have the most familiarity with is kind of the quintessential messy handwriting, right? Issues with spacing and letter alignment, number alignment, letter alignment, legibility. And those are due to issues with graphomotor skills. And so this type of dysgraphia actually falls under the umbrella of something called developmental coordination disorder. And deficits in this area are going to really impact a child's ability to perform a wide range of handwritten tasks. And then, although sometimes, messy handwriting can get downplayed as, well, we'll just give a kid assistive tech, or they'll be able to type something out, or just kind of an issue of them writing too fast, like needing to slow down. Having issues with the graphomotor component of writing can really then be a barrier to higher order aspects of the task. So, for example, if somebody is putting in a lot of cognitive effort into how to form different letters or space things, that is mental bandwidth that's not going into the act of the cognitive act of writing, like expressing themselves. And they're going to be more likely to make some of those errors with things like sentence structure or grammar or punctuation because more of their mental bandwidth is going towards the physical act of writing. And although sometimes it's appropriate to use assistive tech like a laptop, right, or text to speech to kind of remediate those deficits, there's other times when that isn't an appropriate sub. So, for example, computing math problems, requires a student to really be able to read their own writing and keep track of, the different numbers like a 6 and a 9 and all those different pieces, as well as keeping their numbers lined up in neat orders when they're doing computational problems. And those are not areas that are as easy to sub with assistive tech. And then also, especially for younger students, the graphomotor dysgraphia is important because we want to make sure that somebody has the foundational skills of writing. So if assistive tech is not available, they would still be able to put pen to paper and fill out a form, for example, or jot down a note, or just do those kind of day-to-day demands that you would need the physical act of writing for. So James, can you talk through a little bit about the intersection of dysgraphia and dyslexia with spelling?
Yeah, for sure. And just to piggyback a little bit on what you're saying, too, here with the graphomotor difficulties and whether or not we just say, okay, we're just going to use assistive technology instead, we're never going to require them to write. Well, as somebody, as an adult who handwrites less and less and less and entered adulthood with not good handwriting as it is, if you don't use it, you lose it. And for young kids, I think it's important that we're not missing the opportunity to help them in developing those fine motor skills that are required, for writing, and not jumping the gun and just putting a device in front of them. I think we could probably have a whole podcast on our alone just on the benefits to learning of using paper and pencil. But again, if we're not helping them to develop those skills, we're going to sort of miss the opportunity to do so, and probably even further hamper their development. So yeah, and I'm definitely, especially with younger kids, a proponent of working on developing those fine motor skills for kids that have graphomotor dysgraphia, and not just saying, oh, those skills don't matter. They absolutely matter. Yeah, and there's definitely, intersection between dysgraphia and dyslexia, primarily around spelling, right? And so not just around spelling, also aspects of writing mechanics, capitalization, punctuation, things like that. That we also see difficulties with kids that have dyslexia. But kids who have dyslexia are going to struggle with spelling. Even when we remediate word level reading, spelling tends to lag behind. So when we have kids who've received early reading intervention, and we're able to narrow the gap and get their reading skills close to the average range, a lot of times their spelling is still below average. And obviously, if we're having difficulty spelling words, that can really affect our written expression. Both in, people might not be able to decipher the word that we're writing, but similar to what you talked about with the mental bandwidth with handwriting. If we're dedicating too much mental bandwidth to figuring out how to spell a word, we're going to lose the fluency in our writing, and it's going to affect our grammar and sentence structure, our organization and clarity of our written expression as well too. So the difficulties of spelling certainly go beyond that. The thing I would say too, though, that's interesting with dysgraphia is you will see kids sometimes that with dysgraphia who have below average range spelling but average reading, which is a really sort of interesting phenomenon, and it seems to be tied to kids' orthographic processing abilities, their ability to create a mental image of the way that the word looks. And kind of going back to this idea of the importance of doing tasks with paper and pencil versus doing everything on a device, is neurologically there seems to be a connection between the physical act of writing the word and creating the mental representation of the way that that word looks. So kids that have this graphomotor dysgraphia might have good phonemic awareness, meaning they can process the sounds within words, they can decode and sound out words, but they struggle with this orthographic processing, and there may very well be a neurological link between those fine motor difficulties and the difficulty in the physical act of writing the word and creating that mental representation of the word. So certainly there's kids that have dyslexia who will struggle to write because of their dyslexia. There's also kids with a graphomotor dysgraphia who struggle with orthographic processing or creating that mental representation of the word and still struggle with spelling, even though they can read okay.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, it's so interesting. I think going back to spelling too, is another area that tends to get passed on to assistive tech quite often. So spelling is often downplayed in school districts' writing assessments as an area that, well, it's just spelling. We'll give them spell check, and then kind of it will remediate the issue. We can move on to different areas of writing instruction. But I think what you're speaking to really talks about the deeper neurological components that can be underpinning kind of a more surface level observation of the kid has trouble with spelling. Like there can be a lot going on behind the scenes that's causing that is impactful. I think the other thing that I see quite frequently with spelling is sometimes kids that struggle with spelling are very embarrassed to then write. And this comes up a lot in testing where, I'll ask a kid to write a paragraph and they'll freeze or, seize up and say, oh, well, I don't know how to spell it. And, I'll tell them it's okay. Spelling doesn't count on this. Like, let's just get down your best effort. But that can really hinder a student's ability to feel confident and to get their thoughts down on paper when they know that they're not spelling things correctly and they're hesitant about, having it be judged or not being able to be understood by the reader.
Right, and the writing that doesn't reflect their vocabulary, right? Because they're unable, and then potentially even unwilling to try to spell a word, that they know the word and they know the word's meaning, but they can't use it in their writing as a result of their spelling difficulties. And I mean, yeah, I was going to offer sort of a silly example of it, right? But I mean, as somebody who has like spelling difficulties myself, right? I mean, it does affect things, right? Like I remember there was a period when my wife and I were in our 20s, right? And everybody that we knew was getting married, and I was literally banned from writing congratulations on any card at any wedding we ever went to because I couldn't spell the word congratulations. And so I mean it's sort of a silly example, but it does sort of it can have sometimes silly and sometimes meaningful, real world impact. And I remember my wife saying, "Hey, James, you've got a doctorate degree. You can't misspell congratulations at a wedding." So I mean, what sort of speaking to what you said, right? Like this, inability to engage in certain types of writing because of an inability to spell.
Mhm, mhm, and sometimes not to, have somebody understand what they're writing for it to completely interfere with not only the reader's ability to understand it, but if you're doing something like taking notes in class, your ability to go back and maybe understood what you were trying to
Yeah,
communicate.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I know we haven't even gotten to interventions and things like that yet, but note taking assistance as kids are getting older, is a big one because of the difficulties, one, keeping up with the notes in class, but then two, how useful are those notes if I get back home to study and I don't even know what it is that I wrote.
Mhm, mhm. And
Yeah.
the other two areas with dysgraphia that we should spend a little time talking about are fluency and organization and clarity. So, writing fluency, as I mentioned earlier, really refers to someone's ability to get thoughts down on paper, right? So, how quickly is somebody able to jot down what they're thinking of or come up with ideas that they can then put in writing? Slow writing fluency, again, sometimes is pitched or framed as well. They just need extended time, but writing can be so arduous for kids who struggle with writing fluency that, again, it can really limit their ability, not just to get things done on time, but the overall content of what they're able to communicate. What do you typically see with your writing fluency kiddos who are struggling in this area?
Yeah, and kids can struggle with writing fluency, for a number of different reasons. A lot of times well, in all honesty, tied to some of the things we've already talked about, right? A lot of times I'll see it tied to the graphomotor difficulties, and like you said, with the difficulties in terms of forming the letters, the longer it takes me to be able to get my thoughts down on paper, it does tax that mental bandwidth that you were talking about earlier in terms of my ability to organize my thoughts, to sequence the words, to consider, grammar and writing mechanics and all of these things. And so you sort of see these difficulties with these lower level writing skills having a downward impact on the higher level writing skills, right? So because it's harder for me to form the letters, or because it's harder for me to spell the words, or it's taking longer for me to do those things, you certainly see the impact on the sort of larger aspects of the quality of my written expression in terms of the organization and clarity of what it is I'm trying to communicate. And we've had a number of kids in the office this fall that I'm thinking about right now where that was the core issue, right? That they had strong verbal abilities. They had these kids that just have like wonderful ideas, right? Like they can tell you this elaborate story, but as soon as you ask them to get it down on paper, everything seems to come apart. And again, it could be tied to the graphomotor difficulties, the spelling difficulties. We haven't talked too much yet about executive functioning, but also it could be very much tied to just the fluency and the speed of written production.
Mhm, mhm. And as you're talking about that mental bandwidth being eaten up, I'm also thinking about the working memory component, right? So if you're slow in your ability to organize those thoughts on paper, you're probably going to struggle with things like keeping your eye on the larger thesis you're writing about, making sure you're including all the supporting details you need to.
Right.
So again, it really speaks to all these foundational pieces, the physical act of writing, how quickly are you writing? Are you spelling things correctly? Can really add up and have these bigger impacts on written expression that when they're looked at in isolation can really be minimized. Again, like, oh, it's just spelling. Oh, it's just how quickly you're writing. Oh, your handwriting is just messy. But these things can combine to create bigger issues with written expressions that is quite impactful. I
Yeah.
think, mhm, go
Oh,
ahead.
just to sort of like add to that too, and maybe this is getting a little bit too far down into the weeds. And again, we'll talk about executive functioning, I'm sure, here in a little bit. When I think about executive functioning, I think about executing, right? Like executing a task. And a really important executive function is this idea of working memory. And for those who aren't, neuropsychologists, right? I mean, it's our mental bandwidth, right? It's how much information can we hold on to in our mind that's then needed to be able to execute that task. And working memory is constrained by two primary factors. Like one is the amount of information, right? Like as human beings, we're capped in terms of how much information we can hold in our mind. Like it's not this infinite resource, right? We're capped. But the other thing is time, is how long I have to hold on to that information for. So the smaller amount of information is easier to hold on to, and if for a shorter period of time, it's easier to hold on to. But as the information gets more complex, and there's more factors to consider, and the longer I have to hold on to that information to execute the task, my working memory is going to be constrained. And so even if I've got good working memory, if there's a time component and it's taking longer for me to execute the task, and I have to hold on to that information, suddenly it's going to impact my working memory, and I'm going to start forgetting things, and some key pieces of information are going to get left out as a result.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, I think that's a good segue to start talking about written expression and its intersection with executive skills. So I think to cue us up, I mean, the other component that we haven't touched upon yet is the longer form aspects of writing, right? So far we're talking more about these foundational aspects, but when we're also looking then at somebody's ability to construct a paragraph or particularly an essay, there's a lot of organization and self-monitoring that goes into that skill, right? And so, can you talk through, James, the role that written expression plays when a student is setting pencil to paper to write something longer form, like an essay?
Yeah, for sure. And I'm thinking too already about like, how these skills are assessed also, because that's oftentimes a piece that's missing when we're looking at, how these skills are assessed is we're not getting, writing samples of, upper elementary, middle, and high school students composing paragraphs and multi-paragraph writing products, right? Um, but I'm sort of pausing for a moment too, trying to think if I can. It's hard to imagine, an academic task that has a higher executive functioning load than writing. I mean, there's so many things that have to. I mean, some things just have to become automatic, right? So that they're not taking up, conscious working memory space, right? So we talked about like the handwriting or spelling, grammar, just writing mechanics, capitalization, punctuation, right? I mean, if those things aren't automatic yet, those are taking up mental space while I'm writing. Now, ideally, those become so automatic that I don't have to think about it, and then that frees up mental space for me to consider other aspects of the writing process. But when you think about everything in writing, from handwriting to spelling to grammar to punctuation, capitalization, uh, sentence structure, just sort of the cohesiveness and flow of ideas that I'm trying to communicate, the organization of those ideas, the clarity of my communication in terms of providing sufficient detail so that the person who's reading what I'm writing can understand what it is that I'm trying to communicate, right? And again, I guess directly related to that too. Now I'm also having to put myself in the mind of the reader, right? To make sure that somebody who doesn't have access to all the information that I have I can kind of put myself in their shoes and imagine them understanding what it is I'm trying to communicate. So there's all of these different things that are going on simultaneously, in my mind that really just max out sort of executive functioning. We keep using the word like bandwidth, right? And then you get to the actual executive functioning aspects of the task, right? Like I have to, what is I'm going to write about, right? There's all of this planning and organization of my ideas, and how am I going to sequence these ideas, and what about sort of self-monitoring and making corrections as I'm going along, producing this written product. I mean, there's so many different executive functioning demands that are required for writing that, not surprisingly, when we're assessing kids that have executive functioning difficulties, whether that's related to, ADHD and executive functioning difficulties, whether that's related to autism and executive functioning difficulties, whether it's just related to somebody who has poor working memory and just can't manage all that information all at one time when they're composing a written product. Almost universally, when we see difficulties with executive functioning, we're going to see difficulties with sort of long form writing.
Mhm, mhm. So, with that in mind, it's of course really important that that processing area be thoroughly assessed in when we're looking at dysgraphia, right? So we want to make sure that the psychoeducational testing or the neuroeducational testing really zooms in thoroughly on all these different aspects of executive functioning, right? Your ability to sustain attention, be cognitively flexible between different things you're rotating your attention between, self-monitor, inhibit your maybe predisposition to go off kind of off on a tangent and lose the plot of what you're writing about. So there's a lot of things that we want to make sure we're gathering direct assessment data on through the testing process with executive skills. Other areas that are commonly impacted for spelling, we're really looking again at those same reading related processes that we see with dyslexia, right? So we want to make sure we're testing phonological processing and orthographic processing skills so we can see if either of those processes are underpinning the deficits in spelling. For other reading or, so, excuse me, writing disabilities, we want to make sure we're also looking at verbal skills really comprehensively, right? So we want to look at vocabulary, verbal reasoning. So can the student understand definitions of words? Are they able to retrieve words from their long-term memory? How are different concepts related? Are they able to explain, similarities, analogies, the links between verbal concepts? Verbal memory is really important, right? So somebody's ability to remember what the writing prompt is, recall information from lectures or texts that they can then incorporate into what they're writing. Verbal processing speed, we spoke about a little bit already, but how quickly can they retrieve verbal information, whether that be semantic information or orthographic based information, based on different categories and schemas. So for example, if you're going to be writing an essay about whales, right, you need to have all of the language organized in different buckets, whether it be like the scientific terms or, the different vocabulary that was introduced in lectures, or, oh, I know that it's, this kind of whale starts with an O, it's an orca, right? Can you retrieve all that information quickly and efficiently and get it down on paper? Are there other areas from the cognitive processing lens, James, that you think are really important to include in a dysgraphia assessment?
Yeah, I mean, you certainly covered a lot. So yeah, I mean, reiterating some of the things you talked about, you mean like fine motor coordinate. Now, well, maybe I'll sort of get down the weeds here a little bit, right? It's always tough too because we're talking to parents, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to use these terms, and I don't think a lot of people listening to us are necessarily going to know what it is. Um, but a lot of times when the school district does an assessment, right, they might look at what they call like visual motor integration, which is really the ability to kind of like integrate my fine motor coordination with accurate visual perception. But sometimes they don't go and just really assess fine motor coordination alone, right? So sometimes when you get into the details of some of this testing, the things are missed, right? So certainly looking at things like fine motor coordination, but not just fine motor coordination in terms of like tracing within a defined period with space, right? Which is how these skills are often assessed, but also assessing actual like letter formation, actual letter spacing, letter placement, sizing, all these things that we're looking at this dysgraphia. I think it's important to look at just sort of their underlying fine motor abilities, but then also, again, look at the actual act of writing, and I think again, looking at letter formation, looking at letter spacing, looking at letter sizing, looking at letter, placement on the line, I mean, these are all things that we can assess as well too. And I think important to take a look at when we're looking at like that graphomotor dysgraphia. Again, like you said, with spelling difficulties, it's all the sort of the classic reading related processes that you talked about. And then executive functioning. I mean, it could just, you mentioned a bunch of them, right? Like cognitive flexibility, like inhibitory control. You talked about, working memory ability, and then like you said, all those aspects of language. Like if I struggle with my, there's many, not all aspects of expressive language are going to show up in writing, right? That there are some that I don't want to. It's not universally true, right? But there's a lot of aspects of just my ability to communicate through language verbally that are going to show up in my writing, which I think you talked about. A number of those areas as well too, and yeah, and you talked about the memory piece too, right? Like because as I'm generating writing, I'm having to recall all this information from memory to think about what it is I want to communicate and how those things linked together, and how I'm going to sequence those ideas, in a in a structure that's going to again make sense to that reader. So I think I think you covered it really well.
Yeah, I think a big thing to take away from this piece of the conversation is if you have concerns about dysgraphia and your child is struggling in writing and you were told there was no processing deficit that underpinned those concerns with writing, that's a really big flag, right? Because as you can tell when we're talking, dysgraphia covers so many different processing areas from the physical to the cognitive, and there's so many different subsets of skills that you really want to make sure you're getting that second opinion or pushing back if there's not a processing deficit that's identified.
You just
Similarly,
poked a nerve with me real quick. Sorry. But any time the school district says that, yeah, they have a deficit in reading, writing, or math, but we couldn't find the processing disorder, so they're not eligible. My God, please go get an IE. I think we've said this in other talks, but absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. And anytime they say they acknowledge the deficit in the academic achievement area, but they say it's because they don't have a processing disorder, but they can rule out that it's not due to lack of education, lack of English knowledge, like sort of any sort of other factors. There's a processing disorder. They just didn't find it.
Mhm, mhm, mhm. Yes, I think succinctly put, get that second opinion, get that IEE, don't accept that statement at surface value. I think similarly, piggybacking on these cognitive processing areas, what are components that we should be looking for a thorough academic assessment? So I know this is a really
Yeah.
common area we get referral concerns for at our clinic, right? Where somebody refers their child for a dysgraphia evaluation through the school district. And then there's maybe two scores in the report, right, as part of a broader achievement battery that both say writing is average. And then, the discussion moves on, they're not eligible, and the parent is left pretty confused, right? Of like, where did this score in the 90s or hundreds come from that's saying it's average, where the wheels are really falling off the bus at home when it's homework time, or just what writing samples they're bringing home seems so discrepant from what's being reported out as average writing skills. So what are some of the things, James, that you would want to make sure that parents are aware of when they're looking at schools academic assessments in writing?
Yeah. This is an area where a lot of district assessments are flat out lacking. They are getting a little bit better. There are some tests now that I see being used more that are more appropriate. The one just real quick red flag is if the academic achievement battery that they gave is called the Woodcock-Johnson test of academic achievement. The writing samples test on there is garbage. I don't know how else to say it. I mean, especially like if you're looking at anybody sort of upper elementary, middle, or high school level. And what I would suggest is if they gave that test, well, one, ask for the report in advance if you can get it ahead of an IP meeting, right? And then if you see that they gave that test, the WJ4, right, the Woodcock-Johnson test of achievement. If they gave that test and they got an average or better score, because sometimes I've seen scores for kids who have significant writing deficits and they're actually above average. I mean, so if they gave that test, collect writing samples for your child and take them to the IP meeting with you. And then when they talk about the writing test being average or above average, say, okay, I'd like to see the protocol. Show me the writing that they did. And what you'll see is that they were given a fill in the blank test. They in some of the tasks they might have had to write whole sentences, but they certainly didn't have to like compose anything longer than that. And there's a lot of things on that test that is not even um, uh, checking for, right? Like there's a lot of aspects of like spelling and writing mechanics that don't even get dinged on that test, right? A lot of times it's just if they use sort of like the right vocabulary term or something. So I would bring your writing samples and ask to see theirs, and then in front of the whole team, compare the two, right? So you can show what's being asked of them in class of what they're producing, and they can show what they actually tested them on, because those two can be two very different things. So I think that's important to do, particularly with that test, but even with other tests as well too. So even tests that we commonly give, a lot of times it's trying to measure very discrete skills, right? So one uh, uh, task will be looking at editing for capitalization punctuation. Another test might be looking for a particular transition word, right? Another test might be looking at using the right verb tense or something like that. And then maybe there's a part of it where they produce a larger writing sample. And when the tests are constructed that way, then all of those scores kind of get pulled together into one overall score. And sometimes that can mask some of the writing difficulties, right? So if somebody did pretty well on some of the discrete measures of writing because they have good writing mechanics, right? They know how to capitalize and punctuate things. They've got a decent vocabulary, so they can take a word and create a sentence out of it, right? But they can't produce a longer written product. That might only be a handful of scores from that entire test battery. So sometimes that can kind of get lost in the overall test score. There are tests that look at like just writing samples, where they really say, okay, here's 10 minutes, 15 minutes to produce a writing sample on a particular topic. We're going to give you 5 minutes to plan what you're going to write, and then you have 15 minutes to write it. And for some of the older kids, I think having a test like that is really helpful. When some of the sort of standard tests that are given don't illustrate the degree of difficulty that they're having with their writing. Particularly, we talk about that executive aspect of writing. The lower level test, they've got a spelling test on it. If it's a young child and we're really looking at like the sentence level of writing, the word and sentence level of writing, most of those sort of standard battery tests do a pretty good job of that. I think where they sometimes miss is sort of this executive aspect of writing, where and we're not just talking about high school students, middle school, we're talking about upper elementary age kids when we're being expected to produce a multi-paragraph writing product, and the tests don't always do a very good job of that.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, and I think other areas that are commonly omitted are writing fluency. So you'll see, samples of writing gathered again, maybe at the sentence level, but you won't see a student's ability to produce written work under timed constraints. So that's another flag to be on the lookout for. And then there's also different types of spelling measures. So, when we're looking at spelling, we can be looking at, somebody's ability to uh, passively recognize different spelling versus encode, their orthographic and phonological knowledge down on paper. So again, there's a lot of nuance. So if there is an area where you have a lot of concerns about, writing essays or how long it's taking your child to write something or their spelling abilities. And again, the testing is coming back as being just average that you're hearing. That may not be an accurate reflection of your child because of these layers that are in these individual tests that, again, as a parent, you're not going to know about. If it's not your background as a psychologist, you don't know that there's all these different brand name tests that have all of these different slight tweaks of how they measure these things. But those slight tweaks can make a really big difference in terms of how deeply an assessment is drilling down on areas of concern academically.
And I don't feel bad like making plugs, right? I'm not necessarily trying to make a plug because it doesn't have to be us. But if you do have questions about it, like we have the knowledge to like look at the test that was given, and we know immediately, like, oh, they gave that test. Here's what they missed. Here's what they should have given instead. And then we've got those alternative tests that are really gonna like maybe there isn't a difficulty. I mean, I suppose that's a possibility, right? But if we see, okay, here's a kid that has some attention and executive functioning difficulties, they gave this writing test. Well, I know immediately that didn't capture their executive function difficulties with writing. And then I will know immediately, and Danielle would, and anyone in our clinic, hey, we should need to give this test over here instead, so that we get an accurate representation of where their skills currently lie. And it doesn't just have to be us, right? I mean, there's other people out there that do the same thing. But to Danielle's point, as a parent, you wouldn't have that information. You just know we assessed it writing. They said the writing was fine. You don't know how that test differs from a number of different other tests and why another test might be more appropriate. But we do. So if the district gives you a lot of pushback, you can always say like, okay, fine. Like we're not getting anywhere here. I just want a second opinion, and you can get a second opinion assessment from somebody who knows the right test to give.
Absolutely, yeah. And to kind of bring it home here in our last bit of time together. So obviously, learning disability SLD under IDEA covers written expression, it covers writing. Something to elevate is that the Ed Code does specifically reference spelling. So sometimes, again, spelling is downplayed, but if spelling is playing into, as we talked about, this hierarchical structure of greater writing difficulties, that is something that needs to be addressed and advocated for. Um, the other component, though, that I want to make sure we talk about quickly is how do we treat writing disorders? So it's a little bit different than something like dyslexia, where there is a structured literacy component that's drilled down on for every student that has a dyslexic profile, pretty much, right? What about writing, James? How do parents who have students or children with dysgraphia go about getting services and treatment for their child, both in the school system or privately?
Yeah, for sure. And just real quick, we were jumping to like sort of the treatment end of things, just because you brought up spelling. and the district sort of disregarding spelling as being part of a disorder of written expression. I mean, I've even seen now sort of the extreme result of that, where they're not even testing spelling. They don't even assess a child's spelling ability because they say, well, we're looking at written expression, we're not looking at spelling. Well, clearly spelling is an important component of written expression, right? And so they've, again, the worst case scenarios where I've seen the district doesn't even assess it. Well, clearly they didn't. In that case, they didn't assess in all areas of suspected disability. I mean, they just failed to do their job at that point. But do keep an eye open for that if you're a parent, if they do the testing and they didn't even look at spelling. As far as treatment goes, and obviously, you and I, like, our specialization is an assessment and diagnosis and making recommendations around treatment, right? I'm not a treatment provider, right? But I think it really ties back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of identifying the area, specifically identifying the area of need, right? So, okay, a child has difficulty with writing. Well, that's a pretty wide spectrum of potential challenges, right? So we really want to drill down and say, okay, what is the nature of their writing difficulties, right? And if it's with the graphomotor aspect of writing, then that's where we're going to intervene, right? And in school settings, sometimes that's done by a special education teacher. Oftentimes it's done by an occupational therapist. That can work with the child on their fine motor production. Everything from how their pencil grip and how they hold the pencil, how hard or light do they press down on the paper, what about their body posture when they're writing, if there's some core stability difficulties, are they anchoring the paper with their other hand? I mean, there's sort of just general motor functions that they can work on developing those skills. And then beyond that, then you're providing interventions. There's a number of ones out there. Sort of a long time tested one is like handwriting without tears, where you're actually providing structured intervention around letter formation, letter sizing, letter spacing, letter placement, spacing between letters and words. To support those graphomotor abilities, the physical act of writing. If you're looking at, then when we moved on to spelling, oftentimes, like we talked about, kids that have, spelling difficulties, oftentimes it's tied to their dyslexia. And so, dyslexia interventions, sort of the scientific-based structured literacy instruction, where, this very systematic delivery of reading intervention, it will include a spelling component of it. So when you're working on, letter sounds or blending sounds or writing words or writing phrases, writing sentences, those interventions, those multisensory interventions include a spelling component to it. And you could deliver a similar type of intervention again to work on their spelling, but it's not a matter rather of just memorizing unrelated words, right? So imagine being in a second grade classroom or something like that, and they gave out your spelling list for the week, and there isn't any necessary relationship between the orthographic patterns in those words. Maybe they're just words that were pulled out of the novel that the class is reading, right? So again, you want that very structured, very systematic spelling instruction, moving from more sort of basic to complex orthographic patterns, and those spelling tests, and when we're testing their knowledge, we're tying that into the intervention that they're receiving too. So again, starting from very basic to getting to more complex in terms of orthographic patterns that we're teaching them, again, in a very explicit fashion. When you move your way up then to more of the sort of executive functioning aspects of writing, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on this too, obviously Danielle too, but for me, now we're really talking about the writing process, and a lot of times the interventions then are sort of looking at that writing process, and for me it's like, what are all the things you're doing before you sit down and write? And then what are all the different, like, self-monitoring and revising parts of the writing process then too, right? Writing isn't something that we just sit down and we just sit down and write an essay, right? That's not how it works. I mean, some kids might want to do it that way. They want to sit down and bang out a 5-paragraph essay and turn it in. But that's not how we approach writing, and it's definitely not how we approach writing if we have executive functioning difficulties for all the reasons that we talked about earlier, how that's darn near impossible, for someone with executive functioning difficulties to be able to do. So here we really are slowing down the writing process, teaching kids how how to brainstorm, teaching kids how to use graphic organizers to structure and sequence their ideas, teaching, kids strategies for going back and elaborating and adding detail to their writing, just sort of self-monitoring and editing procedures where we're checking our work for capitalization, going back, checking it for punctuation, going back, checking it for spelling, going back and checking it for the sort of organization and clarity of our writing. But it really is this focus on this larger writing process, at that point.
Mhm. Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is that the reasons or the description you're giving of the intervention is the reason why I'm always skeptical when I see writing captured under 504 plans as accommodation instead of specialized instruction, right?
Yeah.
Because there's kind of sometimes a knee-jerk reaction to segment out pieces of that process and say, well, okay, we'll give them the Venn diagram or the graphic organizer, done, right? And it's like,
Yeah.
no, right? Like you said, that's like maybe step two, right? Because step one is still like organizing all the information mentally or gathering your notes. And then step two is, okay, now let's take out the graphic organizer. And then how the heck do you use that, right? If you just give it to a student and say, use this to, structure your essay, but you have significant issues again with maybe word retrieval or remembering the content or whatever, that's not going to be very helpful. So,
No.
writing is really intervention tends to be, from what I've seen, very therapeutic almost in its lens. It's a very educational therapy based approach where you're really working with somebody on each step of the process, as you talked about, as opposed to just providing a quick tool, whether that be assistive tech or a template like a graphic organizer or a sentence starter. Like all those things need to work together to remediate writing
Yeah.
issues, as opposed to just being provided in a very siloed approach.
No, for sure. And that's a warning I often give when we start talking about AT for writing, because people might say, oh, let's give them Read and Write, which is a program that has all these built-in tools for supporting written expression. Oh, let's give them Co-Writer. And then suddenly they're just going to be off and running writing. Those programs don't teach you to write. Handing them a paper graphic organizer, right? It doesn't teach you how to write, and so that there's a direct explicit instruction component of even just learning how to use those tools, for the purpose of writing, and even beyond that, right? We're talking about kids that have executive functioning difficulties. A lot of these interventions that we're doing is the adult is taking on the role of their frontal lobe. The adult is taking on the role of the executive function parts of their brain, right? In order to take those tasks on. Now, long term, what we're gradually trying to do is to strengthen their capacities to do that independently, right? But if we have a child that has significant executive function difficulties, there isn't a tool in the world that we're going to hand them and suddenly they're going to be able to write. Again, beyond just learning how to use the tool, they're going to need sort of direct instruction and guidance and prompting as they develop the skills to be able to do that independently. And that's going to require an adult supporting them.
Mhm, mhm. Absolutely. Well, any closing comments, James, before we end today?
Uh, Gosh, I don't know. There's always so much to cover on these topics.
No.
But no, I think this was good and hopefully helpful for parents out there. Reading has gotten a ton of attention in the last 25 years. There's been a lot of focus on reading, the development of a lot of sort of manualized programs for reading intervention, a lot of assessment tools for assessing reading related areas of processing. But writing and math haven't gotten nearly the same amount of attention. And I think a lot of kids that are having these challenges in school, maybe slipping through the cracks, because there's been less of a focus on the topic of dysgraphia, for example. So yeah, so I hope people listening to this find this helpful.
Well, thank you very much, James.
All right, thanks, Anu.